Hi there, I'm Scott, and this is GreatScott Knitting Dyes Yarn, episode 10. Today I will be dyeing two skeins of Patton's classic worsted wool, which is a 100% non-superwash wool. I have used a knitting machine to create a couple of yarn blanks. One is tubular, and the other one is a flat yarn blank. I'll be using food coloring to dye these skeins of yarn. For the tubular skein of yarn, I'm going to be using Wilton's Violet and see if I can get it to break. And on the flat blank, I'm going to be using some leftover sprinkles that I created using Wilton's food coloring and citric acid. It's just some leftover sprinkles that I had, and we're going to just use those up on that particular blank in some random pattern. My sock blank, or my tubular blank, has been soaking in some plain tap water now for about 30 to 40 minutes. And now I'm adding about a quarter teaspoon of the Wilton's Violet icing food coloring to my boiling dye pot. In this pot, I have about 12 cups of water and 2 tablespoons of white vinegar. I've turned down the heat so that it can reduce down to just a boil. The water is super hot, which will be great for helping the yarn absorb the red food coloring that is in that violet. From my tubular blank, I have removed the majority of the water by squeezing it out. And as this dye bath reaches stops moving around quite so much, then I'll start dip dyeing it. This dip dye process, I am going to go really slowly because I want to try to capture some breaking of the color into its blue dye at the end. Now it looks like the majority of the red color has absorbed into the yarn. It's time to go ahead and put the remainder, this little tip, into the dye bath and let the rest of the blue colors absorb into the yarn. So I just want to make sure that all of the yarn is submerged into that color. And I'm going to go ahead and add a couple more tablespoons of white vinegar to help the last of those blue colors absorb into the dye, or into the yarn. So I'll just kind of mix that in a little bit. I'll reduce the heat again. I'm going to cover it and we'll let it sit for about 20 minutes, maybe 40 minutes, to let those colors absorb. It's been about 40 minutes, and so we're going to check to see where we're at with the absorption of our dye. With my white bowl test, I can see that there is just a little bit of dye still in that dye pot, but I'm going to go ahead and turn off the heat. We'll just take a look at a little bit of our yarn, and yeah, it looks really nice. But I can see that there is a little bit of color left in the dye bath. So I'm going to go ahead and put this back in. Let this pot cool completely, and then we will rinse the yarn. Now we have our flat yarn blank, which has been soaking in some vinegar water for about an hour. I'm going to take my powdered sprinkles, which again is food coloring and citric acid, and I'm just going to use this sieve to sprinkle some lines of color onto this yarn blank. The yarn blank is still very wet. I didn't remove a lot of the water, so it's not sopping, but it is still quite damp. And because these sprinkles I'm using have citric acid in them, a lot of this color is going to strike relatively quickly onto the yarn. I'm not sure if this is going to look so much like speckles, or if with the amount of liquid that is still in the yarn, if it will turn into more of a wash of color. But we'll see when it ends up. Right now it looks much more sprinkly, although very concentrated in some areas. So that was a red color. And so the next one is really a combination of blue sprinkles and green sprinkles. And I'm using a finer sieve on this just to see how it turns out. And it looks like a lot of the green sprinkles are sifting through, but the blue ones really aren't. So it seems like maybe the blue and the green food coloring adhered to the citric acid in different ways. And I'm leaving a lot of white space as well, because I think that'll make it look interesting. So it looks like I have a lot of blue sprinkles here, so I'm just going to like dump out some of this blue. Oh, having troubles getting it to come out. So I'm going to continue doing this sprinkling technique, and I'm going to speed this process up a little bit so you're not bored with this. It looks like it's going to look somewhat of a Christmassy stripe skein of yarn, but that's okay. I think it'll still be pretty. With the sprinkling process completed, I'm now going to wrap my skein of yarn in this plastic wrap that I had on the counter. I'm just going to cover these edges over, and then I'm going to roll it up into somewhat of a jelly roll, and then I will I'm going to steam set this. I'm not going to use the microwave. I'm going to use a steam set this in a pot on the stove. And so I'm going to carefully roll this up. I want to try and keep the colors from bleeding together as much as possible. Although it's very possible that some of it could bleed and blend a little bit. And you can see that even on the underside that that color has permeated and all the way through. And so I'll seal that edge, and so now that's ready to be put into a pot and steam set. We're going to start with rinsing our tubular broken violet skein. And as you can see, we've got a range from a reddish violet all the way through blues and to a final blue on the end. And so it's generally a gradient, although it seems to be somewhat the same color all throughout. I'm going to test the temperature of the water so I can get it close to the same temperature as the skein of yarn, as it's still slightly warm. So I don't want to shock the fibers because this is non-superwash wool, so I do need to be careful with it. We're going to rinse it to, number one, rinse out the vinegars, and also to check for color fastness to make sure that it doesn't bleed a whole lot. And so here we go, and we'll see what happens. So initially, with the very little bit of water that's here, I'm not seeing any bleeding that is occurring yet. So we'll get this good and saturated with water again to begin rinsing out that vinegar. And it looks like the color is solidly in the yarn because I'm not seeing any bleeding occurring at this point. And I am trying to be somewhat gentle with the fiber because I don't want it to felt in any way. And at this point it appears to be color fast. So on this, I'm going to rinse it at least a couple more times. This second rinse, I'm going to use a little bit of clear dish soap. Oftentimes a little clear dish soap will start the bleeding process if there's going to be any. If it does, you do find that you have significant bleeding, you can also soak your dyed yarn in a vinegar bath, and oftentimes that will be enough to stop any bleeding. If it's significant enough, you could pop it into the microwave and heat it back up with vinegar. After you've soaked it in a vinegar bath, heat it back up so that it heat sets again, and that will often put an end to any bleeding. I am not seeing any bleeding going on with this skein of yarn, even with the addition of some soap. So I'm going to finish rinsing this and hang it to dry. All right, here is my flat skein of yarn. I steam set this for right at about 45 minutes because I wanted to make sure that those reds were well set. And then I pulled it out of the steam bath and allowed it to cool on my counter completely. So this is easily handleable. One of the things you might find is that it can sometimes be difficult to find the end of that saran wrap, that plastic wrap. But then here we go. So I'm not seeing any significant cross colorization or cross bleeding, but it looks like maybe some of the colors did spread a little bit more in the steaming process, as I do see a little bit of color mixing, some little sections where the blue-green and the pinks came together. So as I finish getting this saran wrap, or this plastic wrap, off of my yarn, we'll take an initial look at it and then see where we are in terms of bleeding. So at this point, I would say it is not speckled, although there are some areas that kind of have that nature. It is more some solid wash of color in stripes. That's okay. That's really pretty. So starting with some just plain tap water to rinse out any vinegars and also to see if we have bleeding. One thing that you need to be careful of, especially in dealing with any colors based in red, is that you can get some bleeding of that red food coloring. But in general, right now, I'm not seeing any color coming out of the yarn into the water. And again, I want to be gentle with this skein of yarn as it is a non-superwash wool, so it could felt if I get too rough with it. So because I didn't see any bleeding in plain tap water, I'm going to add a little bit of my clear dish soap and see if that dislodges any of the color. And this is just a great way to test that color fastness. What I'm seeing is great. I'm not seeing any color coming out of this yarn. So I'm going to finish this rinse and hang this up to dry as well. And then we'll look at the finished products when they're dry. So here are our dried blanks. The Wilton's Violet looks really great, and there is more of a gradient there than I expected. There's those deep reddish violets on one end, and it really does fade all the way down to that light blue. The flat blank, where I have the stripes, it's really interesting how wide that color spread, especially in the steaming process. I really like how this turned out. Now, once this gets unraveled, I expect to see a very variegated skein of yarn that might potentially pool in different ways depending upon how it's used. I have wound the broken violet skein, that tubular skein, onto my niddy noddy, and here I can really see that gradient play out. There's actually a lot more of the light blue than I expected, or that really kind of appeared when it was in tubular form. I really like how this has turned out. One thing you'll notice is that the yarn has a strong crimp to it, and that comes from having been dyed while it was knit up. I am going to soak this in some plain tap water for a while and give it another wash just to help relax that crimp before I go ahead and twist it up into a skein. And here is the flat skein of yarn, the flat blank, which was in stripes, wound onto my niddy noddy. You can really see the variegated nature of this skein of yarn as it sits here. Because those stripes were on the diagonal, there's a lot of randomness to the placement of the color in this skein. Again, you can see that the yarn is highly crimped, and so I will be soaking this one in some plain tap water as well to help relax those fibers. I definitely want to explore the use of making blanks and playing with different dye techniques. I really love how these two skeins of yarn turned out. I do want to test this out on some superwash wool as well to see how the dye will take up differently, and especially on some flat sock blanks or some flat yarn blanks to play around with different techniques and painting on those blanks. I hope you have enjoyed seeing me dye on yarn blanks as an experiment. I do want to play around with this again in the future. If you have enjoyed this episode, please click like below. And if you enjoy the content you're receiving on this channel, be sure to subscribe and hit the little bell icon so you get notifications as to when I upload new content. Thanks for watching, and enjoy your knitting.